Hi everyone, welcome to our session this afternoon on technology, specifically governing music rights with technology. We have a pretty amazing panel here this afternoon. First, I'm Fiona Robertson. I'm a music and entertainment lawyer based in Dubai, so not quite sure I'm on the technology plane, but let's move on. What I have with me as our first speaker is Spek. I also have Kristen and I have Yuri, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves with 3 lines or less.
Hi, I'm Spek. I'm the founder and CEO of PopArabia and ESMA. PopArabia is the leading music publisher in the Middle East and an independent label. And ESMA is the first rights organization launched in the Gulf earlier this year.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirst and I'm the regional manager for Africa and Middle East at BMAT. At BMAT, we're a neutral data partner for all industries in the music, and we help our partners connect the music copyright picture.
My name is Yuri, Dokter. I'm a founder and CEO of a company called DJ Monitor. We started out in 2005, monitoring music events for rights usage. Then later on moved into venues, streams, etc.
Lovely. Now, so I'm just going to start off with a sort of a general chat about the technology, because what we're actually seeing, having spoken to a few of the creators that are here at the moment, we know that all the creators are using amazing technology to make the music content that everyone is loving to listen to. You guys have got amazing studios, you're talking to each other online, things have been created across the globe with people composing and adding all their components from different parts. That's fantastic, but what we want to talk about today is how do those beautiful creative people who are writing and performing, how are they going to get paid when their music is used by the use of technology? So I'm going to start with you, Spek. If we can just talk about the nitty-gritty of revenue and how technology is feeding into the way the revenue streams from music usage is working in the world right now.
So from a very myopic perspective for me as a music publisher, certainly over the past 10 years in the Middle East, it's sort of changed immensely. Frankly, when we started, starting as a music publisher in the Middle East was pretty difficult to begin with. Copyright is largely difficult to enforce. It's difficult to enforce your rights in the region. And what we found was, with the advent of technology over the past 10 years, it made it a lot easier to police these things. So for example, we all know that music is being used really on commercial campaigns, in television, quite a bit. So once we started representing rights, the first thing that we started doing was going after people and saying, we'd send them a legal notice through somebody like you and saying, hey, you're not allowed to use our song. You need to, pay us or license the rights appropriately. And when it was, say, a state-owned broadcaster, it was very difficult to force a major organization to pay attention to affect a company much smaller than them. And often they would take the view of, screw you, sue me, and we'll respect your rights. That was usually the first thing that people would say. And what happened was there was a mass migration of these businesses moving into the online space. And so nowadays it's really difficult. Every major advertiser has a digital component to whatever it is that they do now. And so they take their campaigns into social media, they take their campaigns into YouTube. And once they take it into the online space, for us, that's a lot easier to start to police. For one, rights holders typically represent have deals with a lot of the social media companies and with YouTube, so they can monetize their rights. And so if somebody is using our music in some sort of campaign or in a background video or anything, we often we always get informed of it through a publisher that we represent, and then we can start to go after people. We can strike the commercial down. There are challenges to that even, but ultimately technology has made the enforcement of copyright a lot more transparent for us as a rights holder. There's always other aspects as well from the rights management perspective. Putting my ESMA hat on now, of course, we're able to monitor how music is used, which Kirsten and Yuri can talk a lot more about. But yes, technology has changed the game really for us.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we all know now that if you put something up on YouTube and it contains a song and it's unlicensed, that there is tracking that's going to find that song and there will be a notification, and we see takedowns all the time, the little black screen. I wonder if Kirsten or Yuri, you could talk about that sort of technology, and then we'll lead into the new technology that sort of evolved from that.
Sure. Okay, so well, at BMAT, we kind of have a plethora of monitoring technologies. We monitor TV and radio. So by doing this, we're monitoring TVs and radios 24/7. We then take the signals and we analyze them in 1 hour chunks. We create an audio fingerprint of the signal, which is basically the most compact and convenient version of a sound recording that we can use for referencing and storing. So we take that and we compare it against a database, which is a huge database of more fingerprints of sound recordings that we have received from rights owners, labels, copyright organizations. And from here, we generate the results, and this is where we provide the results back to whomever. It could be a publisher, a label, a rights owner, and from this, they can do royalty distributions with it. I'm going to let Yuri comment on the venues side of things.
Yeah. So, for instance, this is a box. We have DJs around the world bringing a box like that when they tour, for instance. Boxes like this are in retail outlets, meaning bars, shops, etc. We have a somewhat bigger version with XLR for the professional clubs, but it's not big. It's very small. It's credit card size almost. So it's something that can easily be implemented. And by offering the solution both including hardware and the database and the various MRT algorithms that we use, we aim to provide the best possible music usage report possible. And so she already explained the process. It's the same for TV as it is, for instance, for and online, as it is for venues and events, etc., as well as live streams, for instance. So we can ingest it in real time and create results in real time, or we can do it in batch, preferably, because we get better results, obviously, that way.
I just want to come back to the way the technology actually works, because both of you have said something that I think is really important, which is you're taking these fingerprints and you're popping them back and analysing them against databases. I would like to talk about the databases, particularly for people in the audience who are going to have creations and they want to put them in these databases. Where do you get them from, and how do you ensure that they're accurate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have somewhere between 100 and 110 million reference songs at the moment, so that's quite a lot. Has to be. Currently, we also are installing, for instance, in India, which is quite an interesting market, as there's lots of undocumented music in India, and I would say they're easily in the tens of millions, apparently. I don't know, because I haven't seen it. In the Western world, a lot of the music has been digitized already, although there's always a certain chunk that has not been digitized. So once it's digitized, we can fingerprint it. And whether the original recordings and metadata come from, as Kirsten has already explained, from a distributor, from a record label or copyright association, that really doesn't matter. What's more interesting, and this is something that we mentioned yesterday as well, is the quality of metadata attached to the audio recording, because this is where it always goes wrong. There's disputable metadata often, which is attached to that audio recording. And if we just ingest that, then that means we, at that moment, if the metadata is not correct, it cannot be distributed correctly. So that is a huge challenge, and that's why we use a quality ingestion system, which looks at the source that it comes from, and then keeps on improving the quality of the metadata. And invariably, the major set, we have the last word in this, because otherwise you're simply not rubber stamped by them. So That's also, especially with online, that's a huge thing. Maybe you can.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges with using our technology and helping artists get paid is it's all good and well that we can connect to Warner, Sony, and get all the fingerprints in our database and have 100 million. But when you start looking at emerging markets and new markets where there is a lack of these majors, and these guys are sending CDs or whatever directly to a radio station, or they're with a smaller digital distributor and we're not connected to them, that's like where one of the biggest challenges, at least for me, come in, because that's what I'm dealing with now in Africa, and I think it's going to happen here as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because we're still looking at the Middle East as a market that's quite terrible, bluntly, at getting these databases together with accurate information. And I know that some people go by different names, and so is it Fiona Robertson? Is it Fee? Is it this sort of errors are taking place. So when that happens, when you get a track that gets identified by this little box here, sent back into your database, what do you do with unidentified tracks and unidentified music?
So that's actually very interesting, because the data gets used, especially in emerging markets, for two purposes. One is distribution, and specifically to honor the reciprocal agreements that they have, where they play music from, the Western societies, etc. But another one where it gets used a lot, for instance, in Nigeria now. Do you know, for instance, that in India, I think it's about 0.5% of the venues are properly licensed. Well, properly licensed, they are licensed, but probably under-licensed still. That means there's a huge market there that simply doesn't pay any rights. So what they need is a system to go in there that proves that they have played protected works. And that's what we provide a complete solution for. And then at that moment, they can start selling licenses. So stuff like that happens in emerging markets like Nigeria and India, etc. And I'm pretty sure will happen here as well, because you need to be able to prove it, that you have, that they have used your music. Therefore, music usage reports are very important, not just for distribution purposes.
Spek, if we could just come back to you on this point, because I know you're already working in the Middle East market, and fundamentally, if people aren't getting licenses for what's going on at festivals and events and in retail and hotels, there is no money to trickle down to people who are the creators. So as someone who's trying to convince the market, the paying side of the market, to take this technology on and actually monitor and pay for proper usage, how are you finding the reception for that, and what are you using to convince people?
I think that, look, the advent of collective rights organizations and people representing rights has been around for over 150 years, depending on where you are in the world. The issue is that all of these organizations have sort of slowly evolved over time, and they're now like these massive organizations. It really should be the norm, broadly speaking, that we now have the technology available to do this work, and that's not necessarily the norm everywhere in the world, where the people are putting the technology forward as the process. To people still deal with cue sheets and trying to write down information and that and then sort of cross-referencing that as the way to sort of distribute royalties. Our perspective has always been, we're starting in 2021. We should be using all technology available to us in every instance that we possibly can, and so that's certainly our approach with it. The response from the market, frankly, in many conversations that we've been having with people who are licensees on the ground, is that they don't want the administrative burden of trying to figure out what music that they're using. If you are either putting on a live concert, or you're a TV broadcaster, or you're a radio station, you don't, with everything else that you're planning and that you're doing around putting, disseminating this content in whichever way you're doing it, you don't want to have to add a layer of burden where you need to figure out every single song and or artist that you're playing, because most people just want to play the music. They don't want to have to deal with the burden of solving all of that problem. So actually, we found that people, when we explain to people that there's a better way of doing it, because we have the strong hurdle of getting people to recognize the rights, in a market when they've never had to pay for music before. Then once we get them to recognize that they have to do this and that that they're going to license, their second problem becomes, okay, but how much work is this for me? If I'm going to end up paying you, and then I have to hire somebody to figure out all the music that I'm using, that doesn't work for me. So technology is actually, I think, right at the beginning of the solution of resolving the problem on the ground over here, for at least based on the conversations that we're having with people.
Yuri, do you want to talk to us about live events particularly and how that works from a recording and paying perspective?
Yes, I can. Well, we do quite a lot of large events around the world, ranging from Creamfields in the UK, Perukaville in Germany, Tomorrowland. And sometimes we do these events as an assignment, which is commissioned then by the rights organizations like SACEM, PRS, GEMA, BUMA, etc. APRA, for instance, in New Zealand and Australia. What we do first is we install devices like this, basically in every stage, usually front of house, that's what it's called, so that's where the sound engineers are. And if it's not possible, then it's backstage. If these are venues, then we try to stay away from the DJ booth, because they like to mess around with little trinkets and see, oh, wait a minute, what is this? Oh, it has a USB cable. I need that to charge my phone. I mean, literally. I mean, we had that one day in Watergate. We couldn't reach the device, and it turned out that they needed a power lead, for something else. So that's the first tip. Stay away from DJ booths. So we record the audio. And at that moment, we know where we are. We know which DJ is playing. I mean, if we get that information, we know the location, we know the room that we're at, etc. That means it's a little bit more information, actually, than we need at the moment. But the thing is, it becomes very granular in the near future. So right now, it's just based on a license for the venue, for instance. And then they have a general license for venues that size, for instance. And then they have a reference repertoire, or as PRS calls them, analogies, which sort of groups all those clubs together and then says, okay, we're going to take so much % of all those type of venues, whether they be pubs or whether they be Ministry of Sound or Fabric, for instance, and all those type of venues. That means that they don't have the budget to monitor each and every one, because it's simply too expensive to have these boxes, service these boxes, and monitor these boxes everywhere. So that is basically what happens. We get the audio in, together with all the metadata. We compile the music usage report, and they then use it either for direct distribution, as would happen with most major events, because one play, get play, get pay was the moniker that I coined at ADE, I think it was around 2010, later got used by the AFEM. And, but that's very important, because BUMA was actually the first one to do a pay for play distribution. Nobody else did that in the world. So that's every time your record gets played, you get a certain amount of money. That means that with certain stadium tours, it's huge. It's really huge. With Sensation, you could get like €1,000 per play every time your record got played. Sometimes records were played 4 or 5 times on a night, because every DJ had them in his set. So that's quite a lot of money, of course. It can become even more. I mean, in Germany right now we work with Perukaville, and they pay €1.4 million for rights, music rights, for one festival, not per year or one festival only, which is absolutely insane.
Was that just for public performance, or was that for other rights as well? So
that's 90% performance, 10% neighboring rights. So, but still, so right now we just lay it on the table and force GEMA to rethink their strategy on doing this, because if you collect this, then you should also be able to distribute that money accordingly, and not just have, oh, now we collected all this money because we are GEMA. That's pretty much how GEMA is into this. And then, we're going to distribute it based over serious members, classical, and because that's the way it used to be. But they're really serious about changing that now, luckily, finally.
Spek, can you speak to that, just about the way that the technology is used in actually getting the money down to the creatives?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think that these guys are actually better positioned to talk about the tech side of it. But what I would say is that as it pertains to this aspect, there's two things that sort of come to mind with respect to this. One is, it's not historically at PROs been the norm that there's a faux pas sort of word in the music industry, which is a black box income, that nobody likes to use that term. And what it means is it's money that...
The licensees love the term.
Yeah.
Yeah, the CMOs hate the term.
Yeah. So
just try to use the term and their pants will fall off.
Yeah. So, black box income basically refers to income that you can't identify, right? And so the question becomes then... Well, what do you do with this unidentified money? And actually not even back in the day, but even often if you look at the amount of money that's collected, some of these societies are collecting, PRS collects £1 billion a year, so that's quite a bit of money. Now, a large percentage of that money is coming from bars and restaurants and, shopping malls and barber shops. And none of these people are sitting there and writing down all the music that they use. It's the law says that anytime music gets played, it needs to be licensed. So now they might be collecting, $500 to $1,000 from every one of these little shops, and it adds up to tens of millions of pounds. And once it does add up to tens of millions of pounds, well, how do you distribute that money if you don't know what actual music was played? And I think that, because, as I said, these organizations have evolved over hundreds of years, they came up with different ways to distribute that money. And so some of them came up with these analogies where they said, well, let's look at the top 20 chart, and if Elton John let's look at the radio, and we're going to decide that because the radio reflects these songwriters, then we're going to distribute that money based on whatever's really popular at radio. But guess what? The Indian restaurants in London aren't playing Elton John, and so there's an inherent unfairness, you could argue, that this is not, people getting paid are not reflective of what's actually getting played. And so as we look at ourselves as a new rights organization, we're like, well, actually, screw all that. We can start with a clean slate and say that we can, make our best efforts to ensure that every piece of music that is paid in an accurate way, because the technology now exists. And if you're going to start a new rights organization from a clean slate, you don't necessarily have to model yourself after what's going on in Europe or North America, even though we might think of Europe and North America as the innovators and the future, and think about them as the most developed markets in the world. When we're starting over here, we can actually create the models for what the West is copying. And I think that's the opportunity that we have, that we don't often think of ourselves at, as a Middle Eastern, in the Middle East. We're starting with a blank slate. We can actually create what the future is, and everybody else will end up copying the way that we do it. That's the first point. The second point that I would say is, with Arabic repertoire, it's particularly difficult because most Arabic repertoire isn't in the database because it's not been, historically, labels in the Middle East have all been fragmented. We don't do a good job of sharing information with each other. We're all competing with each other. And so, one label has their own proprietary database. They don't share, because there's not been a history of great rights organizations in the region that have done the job correctly. Most of the big labels are actually not part of the system. And because they're not part of the system, the market is completely fragmented, and there's no sort of unified database of all the information. And then when you add another layer of complexity, which is Some people are putting content online in Roman, numerals and English, sort of characters, and some are doing it in Arabic characters, and there isn't, unification across that. What organization is actually managing the Arabic language, data accurately? And the answer is, historically, nobody is doing that. So these are some of the problems that we're trying to solve as a regional player, and looking at, frankly, the mess that's out there and trying to sort of clean it up so that people can actually get paid accurately.
Well, yeah, just to comment on that, I think, to monitor every single venue in a country is near impossible. But, speaking to how societies used to do it from taking radio data or top hits, monitoring a sample of venues and taking that and doing distributions according to that would be much better, because at the end of the day, it would actually serve the long tail. So the smaller dudes would get paid. We're not, focusing on the 5% of the top earning artists, and actually would create a more healthy ecosystem.
Right, and I think in the end, it shouldn't really matter to the artists and the rights holders if they are being monitored by DJ Monitor or by BMAT or by another party. They just want to get their money. And right now, I think the biggest problem is that we don't share any intel via back and forth, because if we would, we could then share, for instance, the no names or the non-IDs, and see if the other guy does get it, and vice versa, share more information, so we come to a unified database in that sense. But it's still utopia, because we're still competitors in that sense.
Well, and that's the problem that the music industry has, generally speaking. It's not specific to even just the tech side. The labels themselves are competing with each other. They don't necessarily want to share information. And this is sometimes the problem with the music industry is the music industry itself, in the sort of competitive nature of the beast,
Yeah, and the problem is we have to all merge that information into something usable. And that means we have to reprocess the information. But hey, the guy next door is doing the same. He does it in another way. And then the label themselves merge it yet in another way. And it still becomes, unreadable, because they have different definitions, different spelling, different everything, different layers of information. So that's the biggest mess that needs to be solved. I mean, with the technology, it's fine.
Yeah. The only one other point I would add to what Kirsten said about it's impossible to sort of monitor everybody. That's absolutely true, but it's a little bit different in the Gulf, in the sense that, what you tend to find historically, I think it's true of Saudi Arabia, it's also definitely true of the UAE, is that many of the venues using music are ultimately owned by a small group of holding companies that sort of own everything. The shopping, unlike Europe, where you've got like 1,000 different shops down the high street, you end up having a relatively small contained group of companies that actually own a lot of the restaurants and clubs and the rest of it. And so it's still true that you can't, sort of put a box in every single sort of venue, but there's more consolidation of information.
We could try.
Yeah, you can do a lot more. You can do a lot more than you would in Europe, for example.
That's actually what we did with PRS and PPL. So we took the big chains in the UK, then we started monitoring what is the discrepancy between what they play. And it appears they have one music policy. So they might play it at different times. It's not necessarily that they use a stream at the same time, but they have a music policy which would equate for, I would say, over 90% of the music being played is the same throughout all their venues. So that's why we're like, it makes no sense doing 50 different boxes in the same chain. So we might do 2 in the same chain to see if there is discrepancy happening.
I just wanted to come back to the broadcast issue, and we've been talking a lot about public performance because that's obviously where these boxes become incredibly helpful. Are there other rights that you're going to be monitoring when you're doing broadcast, for example? Do you report sync as well as reporting the public performance and the broadcast?
Yeah, I mean, we do everything. We're kind of like the operating system in the music industry. So we help, reporting for mechanicals performing offline, online, sync. So, our outlook into the universe is we want to create transparency for all industry players, and we take any challenge to do that. So,
Spek, are you seeing the same thing in this region as well?
Not yet, but starting. We're getting there. I mean, I don't think that. Well, I know that wasn't happening. Before we set up ESMA. I don't. I mean, I should throw the question to you guys. Were you guys monitoring for any clients in the Gulf states before now?
We've done some tours that happened to go to Dubai, but that's it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's largely true that this is not really. Again, this only becomes an issue if somebody is willing to pay for the rights. And if somebody's not willing to pay, then nobody's going to pay these guys to to do the work. So we're the first in the Gulf to do it. So I think it's only just starting now.
yeah, I think without copyright reformation, the technology becomes slightly null and void. It's like, why?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I've been in this region now for about 13 or 14 years. When I first got here, sync licenses were uncommon. It just, I mean, obviously the copyright law says you have to have a sync license. People weren't getting them. It's now really common that sync licenses are put in place. And now we're having that same battle with public performance licensing because, again, the law says you have to have a license. It's just at the moment those licenses aren't in place. So I think that what we're going to be seeing across time is a real increase in the revenue base that's available for creators. And the one thing that we want to see, even up here on this panel, is we want to see creators being paid for the work that they create. If you're using it, you should be paying for it. And that's what this technology is going to be able to do.
Yeah, I would say that, so just going back to the sync licensing thing, when I first moved to the region at the end of 2006, and the attitude for the first few years certainly was catch me if you can. Whether it was a big brand or, in some cases, honestly, what was happening was, big multinational brands like the soft drinks companies or, Cadbury's or Ford or, big automobile operators, they have a global policy with respect to protection of intellectual property. And if somebody at Pepsi or Coke found out that they had a campaign in the Middle East that was using music that wasn't licensed, they'd be mortified, right? The people would get fired, right? But the problem was they were outsourcing the production of their commercials to ad agencies or film production companies who would promise them that these things were licensed. They were taking the money from the client, and then they were pocketing it themselves, and it was going, and nobody knew any better because nothing was online at the time. And so what was happening was the global affiliates of the music publishers or labels were completely clueless that their music was being used in this way, to promote, something that they never approved and that they never got paid for. It wasn't until we moved into the market, we set up and we started representing major publishers or independent publishers, and I would turn on the TV and I would see something being used, and then we would get a lawyer to send a legal notice up to said agency or production company, which would result in getting rushed into a boardroom with an ad agency and somebody at the ad agency saying, please don't tell so-and-so client that we never actually paid you guys. How much money can we pay you to make this problem go away? And eventually those agencies ended up becoming really good clients of ours, and that's how we started changing the way that things got done.